So welcome, CENTRA, which is the Center for Energy Transition of the Facultad de Ingeniería y Ciencias, Universidad Adolfo Ibáñez, welcomes you to this seminar on the economics of the circular economy transition. I would like to emphasize the fact economics. We will be talking a little bit about economics. We have a very interesting meeting today. We have the world view of what's going on with the circular economy in the world. We have presentations by OECD and OECD on this. Then we have a Latin American perspective through ECLAC. And then we will have a sector perspective looking at specific sector plastics. And then we have a country perspective. We will be looking at Chile with presentations from the Environmental Ministry and myself. So we go from general to particular. And so I think it will be a very interesting meeting. Now, in the meeting, all the people that want to ask questions, please put your questions in the chat. That's the way we will be taking them, and we will be reading those questions and taking them to our presenters. So please, anybody that has any specific questions, please through the chat. Okay, and having said that, this seminar is basically organized in 4 parts. Our opening remarks by myself, CENTRA, and the OECD Environment Directorate. Let me say that we met with Rob 4 years ago in some initial discussions on the Recircle program that I guess he will be commenting on. And so that's the first part. Second part are ambitious policies to foster the transition to a resource-efficient and circular economy. And there we will be talking about Chile. We will be talking about policies for a circular economy transition, what the economics are, the economic impacts of a transition to green copper related to a circular economy will be for Chile, and the European Union perspective specifically on plastics. I understand that's what you will be talking about, Maria. You correct me if that's not the case. Next, please. Okay, and then we have key long-term consequences of transitioning to a circular economy. So we have the sectoral and macroeconomic consequences of circular economy, Latin America and the Caribbean. We will be now moving into the Latin American part and views, and OECD global plastics outlook. Oh, I'm sorry, so it will be Peter with plastics. Okay, Maria gives the European Union perspective. And finally, we will have closing remarks by Eduardo Vitran, ex-Minister of Public Works and expert on energy and transition policies, José Luis Samaniego from ECLAC, and Peter Borky and Tomás Eli. So, having said this, please, Rob, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Raúl. Let me share my screen. There you go. So first of all, thank you all for joining this webinar. We're delighted to be here. We're not delighted to be in Paris. I would have loved to be in Santiago for this webinar and then not have a webinar, but an actual face-to-face meeting. But the situation is still such that travel is hard. But anyway, thanks for this webinar. This is the outcome basically for us of, I think, at least 4 years of research that we've been doing at the OECD on the economic perspective on the circular economy transition. And this is an EU-funded project that we've been carrying out. We have something like 20 reports, I think, in total as part of this research. And the list of the reports is found on the agenda, and you can also have the links on our website. But what I want to start with in this opening session is really a very brief overview of what is an outlook for circular economy and resource use, primarily until 2060. And why do we want to look at 2060, and why do we need big modeling tools in order to say something about what will happen in the coming decades? And then I always have my favorite remark here, and that is, because of the way things are, they will not stay the way they are. The future will be different than what we have currently. And so we cannot just simply assume that because resource use has been growing with 2% per year, it will continue to grow with 2% per year. Things change over time, so you need dedicated large-scale modeling tools to make sense of what are plausible trends that you can foresee for the coming decades. So that's what we'll present today. So first is about this term circular economy. Circularity is not a goal in itself. Rather, it's a means to achieve a goal, and the goal is to have what the Americans call sustainable materials management, or basically how do we use our resources in a way that we have resource security, but also avoid negative environmental consequences from resource use. So this is about closing resource loops and increasing recycling. That's the very narrow part of it. Then you can also think about slowing resource loop through durable design, eco-design, increased repair, etc. And finally, there's narrowing of resource loops and increased resource efficiency and behavioral changes. So basically, when we talk about circular economy, what we effectively mean is the resource efficient and circular economy. And so it's a broad perspective that looks basically at resource management in total and not just at circularity. So first report that I want to share with you is the Global Material Resources Outlook to 2060. That's a major report we did a few years ago. And that looks at the drivers of materials use over the coming decades. So in 2011, the global total use of materials was around 79 gigatons. That's the volume of materials, of raw materials used in the world. So if you take into account economic growth until between 2011 and 2060, you would get a quadrupling of resource use just because the scale of our economies, the scale of economic activity increases over time. But opposing that, we have at least two major trends. One is structural change, the idea that the services sectors in our economy are growing faster than materials using sectors. So basically, we have a lot of economic growth, but part of that economic growth is in sectors that are using less materials. And the second thing is technological change and the idea that we get better and better at producing value added without expanding the resource base for these activities. So together, this means that global materials use increases in our projections from 79 in 2011 to 167 gigatons by 2060. So that's still a doubling of materials use and also a massive increase in the environmental consequences related to the extraction, processing, and discarding of materials. To put this in perspective, I looked up the numbers for Chile, and we find around 640 megatons of materials, raw materials used in Chile in 2011. And the increase is smaller for Chile in the projections, smaller than globally, and it remains below 1 gigaton of raw materials used in Chile by 2060. So the growth in materials use differs widely across countries. In the OECD countries, we see an increase primarily in non-metallic minerals, but also in metals and biomass, and not so much of an increase in fossil fuels. Now in the BRICS, the Brazil, Russia, India, Indonesia, China, and South Africa, so the major emerging economies, we see larger growth rates in most of these, and we see especially a rapid increase in the coming decade, especially in China in terms of materials use, but also in the longer run, we see larger growth rates. And then for the rest of the world, basically mostly the developing countries, the idea is that they start off from a much lower base of resource use, but over time, this resource use grows more rapidly. But because the base is so small, in the end, the volume of resource use and materials use by 2060 is still relatively modest compared to especially the emerging economies. Now, this is not the same for all materials. A lot of the materials that we use in terms of volume is actually sand, gravel, and crushed rock. And this also shows how a relatively simple indicator as the volume of materials used is sort of misleading, because the major environmental consequences, there are environmental consequences related to extraction of sand, gravel, and crushed rock, but they're not as large as some of the other materials. Also, if you think about criticality of materials and resource supply issues, this is not the major one. So we have imperfect indicators to measure kind of materials used, but if we use this volume, the largest one is the one that is used for construction mostly. And if you look over time, how this increases until 2060, and those are the more faded areas here, you see that it's increasing for all of them, but it's not increasing at the same speed. And the reason for that is that when you do this analysis at the detailed sectoral level, so you look at which sectors use which materials in which processes, and which sectors grow faster, which regions grow faster, etc., you get this more nuanced evolution where some materials grow much more rapidly than others. But they're all increasing, apart potentially from crude oil, but that depends also on the evolution of fossil fuel markets, of course. Then on to environmental damages. There are many environmental damages associated with materials use. Here is one example for zinc. Primary zinc materials use is very negative for acidification, but also leads to climate change, energy use related problems. Land use is also an issue, and there are also local pollution issues related to that. But what's important to realize is that when we start switching to recycled materials, so what we call secondary materials, actually those environmental consequences are much smaller. Yes, there is energy use in the recycling phase of materials, but the reduced environmental consequences from extraction especially are so much larger that switching from primary to secondary materials use tends to be much better for the environment. Similarly, for nickel, which is very polluting in many different aspects, the primary is has a lot of pollution, also much larger than zinc, and the secondary hardly any. So it really depends on which material you're looking at, to what extent you can get massive gains in terms of environmental benefits from switching from primary to secondary materials. Then to conclude this introduction, a few words, one slide actually, on our global plastics outlook. So what I presented before were raw materials, so not the processed materials, no textiles, and also not plastics. So what we've done in the last 2 years is doing deep dive into plastics and linking the plastics use and the plastic waste to the same economic activity using the same general modeling methodology. So if you look at from 1980 to 2020, there's a rapid increase in plastics use, up to 460 megatons. Previously, I showed gigatons. This is in megatons, so it's a smaller order of magnitude, but it's still a rapidly increasing plastics use. And if you look at that until 2060, you see a tripling almost of plastics use over time. And this is actually in all the regions in the world. Unfortunately, I don't have detailed results here for Chile, but you do see that in all the regions in the world, there's an increase in plastics use. And one of the specific features of plastics compared to most raw materials is that there is no such thing as a clean sector. Basically, every sector in the economy uses plastics. Think about services, which tend to be touted as a low carbon, low materials use, circular type of sector. But think about all the packaging needed for in services sector, etc. So there's a lot of plastics use also in services sectors, and therefore Plastics use is much broader across the economy than most materials, and it's increasing everywhere. So I think for an introduction, I hope that suffices. It's clear that the environmental problems are getting larger over time, and we need urgent policy action. And I hope today we'll learn more about how that policy action might play out. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rob. Very, very interesting introduction, and also a very interesting document, I must say. I will pass now the floor to Carlos de Miguel, who is the moderator for our second session, Ambitious Policies to Foster the Transition to a Resource-Efficient and Circular Economy. Carlos, the floor is yours, and we have 4 presentations, approximately 40 minutes. The session lasts an hour and 5 minutes, so there will be some time for questions and answers.
Thank you, Raul. Welcome everybody to this session. We have 4 outstanding panelists. I will say that despite the session will be in English, if somebody has a questions and wants to do it in Spanish, we may translate for them. This session, as Raul mentioned, is on policies, the policy mix that is needed to this transition towards a circular economy. This includes labeling, this includes extending production responsibility, and also other type of policies that will be explained by the panelists, and particularly by the government of Chile, which there is a very good policy on circular economy. I will introduce the panelists in the order of the agenda. So the first presentation will be made by Thomas Sayed, which is in charge of the Office of Legislative Implementation and Circular Economy. I have to remember that before these offices in Latin America, before naming a circular economy, there were the offices of waste management. So this explains how is this evolution towards the circular economy. But despite of that, we need to address the issue of waste. Tomás is an electronic civil engineer of the University of Santa Maria, and he holds a PhD on science and technology policies from the Sussex University, and he is probably one of the most expert people in Chile on circular economy. And so, Tomás, you have the floor now.
Thank you very much, Carlos, and everyone that is listening. So I'm going to present the Circular Economy Roadmap, which is a strategic planning process that was undertook from 2019 to 2021, and which is now being executed. It'll be very challenging to do this in 10 minutes, so excuse me if I go a bit fast, but I'll do my best. Here we are. So I think you should be seeing the presentation. If that is not the case, please let me know. So just a bit of an introduction, and something was already mentioned about this. We live in a world which is extracting ever more virgin resources. We see here how from 1970 to 2015, the extraction of resources almost tripled. We are also in a country with a very low material productivity. When we compare ourselves with the rest of OECD countries, we see that we are generating about $0.50 for each kilogram that our economy uses. And we see on this graph that some countries get to levels as high as $6 per kilogram. We are also in a country with a large gap in matters of recycling. Some countries reach very high levels of valorization, and we in Chile have reached only about 15%. And we also have an issue with domestic waste. We see on this table that in the year 2000, the average person in Chile was generating about 295 kilograms of domestic waste per inhabitant. And in 18 years, we increased this almost 50%. And in 2018, we were generating 441 kilograms per habitant. And on the same table, we see how other countries have gone in just the opposite direction. They are decreasing the amount of domestic waste that they're generating. which is what we would like to achieve here too. So in this context, we did the circular economy roadmap in a moment in Chile where there were many organizations doing circular economy projects, but not necessarily linked together. There was a lot of separate efforts, and we saw the need to join this and create a network and project a long-term vision to speed up change. So that led us to this circular economy roadmap. This process to do the roadmap started in 2019 with several studies. In the initial stage, we did some regional workshops. We went to 4 regions in 2019 to find out what their priorities were, what their capabilities were. And then in 2020, we launched a strategic committee of 33 actors from public sector, the private sector, civil society, academia. And these groups started to convene in meetings to develop the roadmap. Then a bit further ahead in the process, we launched 11 thematic discussion groups, and on each of these groups, about 15 people participated. So all in all, we had more than 150 people participating in the process and coming up with ideas to put on the roadmap. With all of this, we did an initial publication of the roadmap, which went to public consultation. And this was then approved by the Council of Ministers for Sustainability in 2021. And now this program is in the implementation phase. We have a program in Corfo, a Transforma program in Corfo, which is in charge of monitoring the roadmap and activating its initiatives. But there's a lot of people and organizations actually contributing to its goals. We adopted a circular economy definition based on the 3 principles that the Ellen MacArthur Foundation proposes. One of them is to design out waste of pollution, and this means recognizing that if you tackle the issue of waste from the design stage, you have much more room to maneuver than if you tackle the issue when you already have a residue, and the only question that you can ask yourself is, can I do something with this which is better than recycling it? There's a second principle, which is keep products and materials in use. And this means that once a material has entered the economy, we should do all that we can to keep there, to keep those resources, to keep that energy in the economy and not allow it to convert into waste. And finally, we have the third principle, which is to regenerate natural systems, which aims to recognize that a large part of our economy is based on what nature gives us. And if we keep in this paradigm where we extract resources from nature, they will be depleted at some point. We need to recognize that there's production systems that can regenerate nature, and we should aim for those. The vision in short form, there's a bit of a longer form vision in the roadmap, is a country where nothing gets wasted and everything is transformed for the care of life. And we have 7 long-term goals in 2 horizons. So we have a green jobs generation goals. We want to decrease the generation of municipal solid waste per capita, decrease also total generation of waste per unit of GDP, increase material productivity. We saw on a previous slide that Chile has a large gap in this matter. Also to increase recycling rates, both the general recycling rate and also the recycling rate of municipal solid waste, and also to recover sites affected by illegal dumping, which is an issue that during the pandemic grew a lot. And for this, we developed a roadmap which has 4 pillars, and we see them there. We have an innovation pillar, which is mostly about what firms have to do to achieve this transition. Then we have a culture pillar, which is mostly about what citizens have to do. then a regulation pillar, which is about what the central government must do to speed up the transition. And finally, we have a circular territories pillar, which aims to put the accent in the fact that different territories might need different versions of the circular economy, the kind of things that make sense for a territory in the north of Chile with an economy based on mining are very different from what a circular economy might mean for a territory, say, in the south of Chile, where the economy is completely different and the problems are not the same. So I only have time to give a few hints about what's within each of these pillars. So let's do that. On the first pillar of innovation, we have 8 initiatives and 30 actions. The roadmap is structured in pillars, then initiatives, and then actions. And some specific things that you'll find in this pillar within the roadmap are to promote the use of circularity diagnostic tools. There are several of these that have been proposed by different organizations, to advance the local eco-design scene through the generation of a community of practice on the matter, and also through the generation of informations to be able to model the local impact of design decisions. Also to collaborate with the banking and the financial sector to help them identify and evaluate the risks of circular economy projects, so they are more willing to finance these projects. Also to develop technical standards for several applications in circular economy which are in dire need, and also finally to pilot circular public purchasing models. Then we have the second pillar, which is the circular culture pillar, and here we have 6 initiatives and 26 actions. And some specific things that you'll find here are to develop communication campaigns on several key issues that were identified during the process, such as food waste or the impacts of fast fashion, to promote the implementation of school innovation competitions in circular economy, so groups of students can work together on circular economy solutions. Also to include the circular economy within the priority areas of the Agencia Nacional de Investigación y Desarrollo. So this is to fund scholarships on circular economy topics, and to elaborate regulations to achieve an harmonious eco-labeling system in Chile. And finally, to incorporate natural capital and ecosystem services accounting in the country's information system. The third pillar is circular regulation. Here we have 8 initiatives and 35 actions. And among other things, we want to study and define the next priority products to regulate through the extended production responsibility mechanism, to regulate, to facilitate the construction of composting plants, which will be very interesting in light of the bill that we are about to enter Congress about organic waste management, to gradually ban the shipment of high-value waste streams to landfills, and to establish a solidarity fee for the cleaning service to fix the issue of structural financing issue that municipalities face now. The financing is not working right for municipalities in Chile in this matter. And finally, we have a circular territories pillar where we have 6 initiatives and 31 actions. And among other things, we have here to incorporate the principles of the circular economy in regional development strategies, support municipalities in municipal organic waste management projects, to promote the development of local supplier programs, to implement a national program for the recovery of public spaces converted into micro garbage dumps, and finally, to promote the articulation between actors linked to gastronomy and tourism to spread the use of local ingredients, products, and preparations. That's it for me. Sorry for having to go so fast, but there's a lot of issues here, and well, you can look at them in more detail by seeing the road. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tomás. It was very clear. I want to remember all of you 4 words: innovation, culture, regulation, and territories. I think that these 4 words are fundamental, and And it's very important the way that this roadmap is being presented with this cartoon, so the broad public can follow it in a nice way. So continuing with the panel, I will introduce to Peter Borke. He's going to present the OECD work on policies for circular economy transition. His principal administration of the OECD Environmental Directorate. He has a long trajectory in environmental policies at the OECD and before, and he holds both degrees in economics and engineering. So, Peter, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Carlos, for the nice introduction. And let me start by congratulating you, Tomas, and your team, and Chile, the Chilean government for that great circular economy roadmap that you developed, because I think you were one of the first in Latin America, and you've really set the bar very high. I think the roadmap is very comprehensive and very well thought through. You will see my presentation is focusing on policy instruments, and you will see it dovetail a little bit with what Tomas has just been presenting, because I will be what I would be trying to do here is to provide an introduction on economic instruments that can support circular economy transition, and then provide you with an overview of the work that we have been doing at the OECD on those economic instruments. So, moving to my first slide. I need to click. Okay, now that works. So moving to my first slide, this is basically a different version of what you saw earlier in Rob's presentation. It's just to remind us what we are trying to do with the circular economy transition. So it's about three things. It's about closing material loops here at the bottom. It's about slowing the material throughput through the economy and keeping material longer in the economy. And it's about increasing the efficiency with which we use materials. And of course, this is a means, as Rob also said, the main objective is to reduce as a consequence the environmental impacts that result from materials use. And I think these are also the three things that we're trying to incentivize through the use of different policy instruments. So why do we focus on economic instruments in our work at the OECD? I think basically what you see here on the right of the slide are the main reasons. It's really economic instruments that do offer the prospect of achieving the circular economy objectives at the lowest cost, because they allow for economic optimization, essentially, and they allow low-cost polluters to essentially decrease their pollution more, and higher cost polluters are companies that have a higher cost at mitigating pollution or achieving circular economy objectives can do a little less, and that's why economic instruments are perceived to be economically efficient. And at the same time, by putting a price on pollution, and allowing companies to decrease what they have to pay through innovation and technological, the introduction of new technologies, essentially production technologies. They are also incentivizing innovation. And finally, and maybe last but not least, they also have the advantage of generating revenue for governments that can be used to also then support the circular economy transition, for instance, through subsidies. So the definition of economic instruments that we use is a broad one. And we essentially include here on the left-hand side what we call explicit economic instruments, such as taxes and charges, tradable permits. They can be recycling certificates, for instance, which are not very widely used, but they exist in a few countries. Deposit refund systems, or subsidies that incentivize, for instance, recycling. But our definition is a bit broader, and we also include a number of other instruments, which I would qualify as quasi-economic instruments. And in there, we have extended producer responsibility schemes, which Chile is also implementing. And we have green public procurement. And let me just explain why we put extended producer responsibility here. EPR is essentially a policy mix that consists of a take-back requirement at the level of producers, as well as a recycling target that's also usually set at the level of sectors or producers, and that then the industry uses then the industry implements the responsibility in the form of producer responsibility organizations that translate that objective and those responsibilities into a price in the form of an EPR fee. And that's why I put extended producer responsibility as a quasi-economic instrument, because it operates ultimately at the level of producers through a price signal. So definition is relatively broad. Then you will see that these economic instruments, they are being used or can be used at different stages of the product life cycle. What you can see here is essentially the product life cycle. It starts from product design and goes all the way in blue here down to the end of life treatment. In green, you can see the material and waste flows, and in orange, you see information and data flows. And so I will walk through this life cycle step by step. So first, at the level of product design, sourcing of materials, and production. Here in the product life cycle, so you can use instruments both to better link product design to end-of-life costs, to discourage producers from using virgin and non-recyclable materials, and to enhance business R&D and eco-innovation. And the instruments that we have for the first here, the linking of design and end-of-life costs, are extended producer responsibility, for instance, when fee modulation applies to design, to incentivize design, for more recyclable products, essentially. Also, green public procurement is an example of an instrument that can achieve that. To discourage producers from using virgin materials, we can use virgin material taxes or taxes on plastics. Both there are examples of now. And finally, to incentivize innovation, subsidies can be used, such as tax relief, for instance, which is a very commonly used way of incentivizing innovation in a lot of countries. The use of these different instruments varies. I mean, I think a lot of countries do use extended producer responsibility. Fewer countries do use extended producer responsibility with fee modulation that really does incentivize, better product design. Virgin material taxes are still not very widespread, but there are quite a few countries that use them for construction aggregates, for instance. Plastic taxes, of course, are being developed in a lot of countries now. so taxes on virgin plastics. At the next stage, which is the consumption stage, instruments can basically be used to influence consumer decisions at the point of sale. They can be used to change consumption practices during products use, and they can be used to change consumer behavior at the product's end of life. And these are fairly different, of course, but in terms of economic instruments, we can use product excise taxes and incentive subsidies, to influence consumer decisions at the point of sale. We can again use incentive subsidies to change practices during products use, so consumer tax reductions and public funds, for instance. And at the end of life, we can incentivize consumers through instruments such as pay-as-you-throw, waste charges, and deposit refund systems. Finally, at the end of life, economic instruments are available to incentivize recycling, and as well as incentivizing reuse and remanufacturing. To incentivize recycling, what's being done in quite a lot of countries, of course, is to use landfill taxes. But there are also a number of other instruments, including extended producer responsibility, and to incentivize reuse and remanufacturing, which is far less well explored. And I would say this is a much more experimental policy agenda. You can use incentive subsidies, and again use extended producer responsibility as a tool, and probably best established instrument here is deposit refund systems, which many countries have had for a very long time. Some of them discarded them in the meanwhile. So what are we doing on this in the OECD? And actually, I'm quite mindful that I might be running towards the end of my time. So I will go relatively quick here, and we will leave the slides with you so you can have a closer look. But we've done a lot of work on extended producer responsibility. There are a few covers here of publications on the left. Sort of our Bible here is EPR guidance for governments that we developed and updated actually back in 2016, so it's still fairly recent. We've also been looking at a number of more specific issues, and we're also planning to do further work on EPR in the future and in the next couple of years, including looking at the use of EPR in new sectors. There's new product groups such as textiles or construction materials, but also to incentivize, reductions of life cycle impacts, not just achieving recycling targets, which EPR is being discussed about in some of our capitals. We've also done quite a lot of work specifically on taxes and charges. We published a paper on the use of taxes on single-use plastics, for instance. We've done quite a lot of work on raw material taxation, specifically on construction aggregates, where we're currently looking at the case of Andalusia and Spain. We've also done quite a lot of modeling work that looks at the impact of raw material taxation in our global material resources outlook and in the global plastics outlook that Rob talked about in his introduction. And we're going to do further work, probably focused around taxation to address plastic pollution going forward. In addition, we've also done work on circular economy labels and information systems. I think that was also mentioned by Tomas. Green public procurement, recycled content requirements for plastics. And we're actually planning to bring all this work together into a report that we plan to develop over the next year. So let me maybe just end with three conclusions. So first of all, I think economic instruments are still insufficiently used to support the circular economy transition, and especially upstream in the product life cycle. I think that's what we're seeing across our membership and even beyond. Also, of course, economic instruments are not standalones. They need to be embedded in a broader policy mix to be effective, including effective enforcement. And generally, there is a lack of experience with the use of economic instruments, especially upstream in the product life cycle, and therefore a need for measure of policy experimentation to develop further insights in how best to design these policies. So I think we're also presented with a rather experimental policy agenda here. So let me stop there, and sorry for going slightly over time.
Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you for expose the wide variety of tools and instruments that we can use to develop the circular economy. Allow me to mention that we are recording this webinar. It's just to check our level of English, so don't worry about that. And also, please be attention that there is already a question regarding the connections between the circular economy and the environmental and social governance initiatives in the organization. So the panel may think about that to answer at the end. Let's go to the third presentation. The third presentation will be made by Raúl O'Ryan, a very good friend of mine. He is an electrical civil engineer and master in industrial engineering for the University of Chile, and he holds a PhD in economics of the University of California, Berkeley. He worked quite a lot of time in the University of Chile. He was also the chief of the area of environment in the UNDP, colleagues in United Nations, and now is the director of the Earth Center at the University of Adolfo Ibáñez. So now, Raúl, you come back again to Chile to address the impacts of the transition to green copper. You have the floor, 10 minutes, and I will raise my hand when the time is over.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction, Carlos. Just to say that what I'm going to be presenting is joint work with CEPAL, so Carlos has participated, but all that I will be saying is mine, so Carlos, you can criticize it. And also joined with the Universidad Católica La Santísima Concepción, a researcher there called Andrés Ulloa. So the point is that Chile is a very dependent country on natural resources, in particular copper, as many Latin American countries and developing countries. And so the question that was circulating in our minds was, what is the impact of these two very big initiatives that are going on in the world, right? One is the move towards a circular, or the need to move towards a circular economy. And the second is the need, of course, to reduce CO2 emissions. So what is the impact on a resource dependent country of such initiatives? So that's why we have this title, Impacts in Chile of a Transition to Green Copper. So the motivation is basically we have a couple of demand drivers with countervailing forces at work. First, the circular economy, which means more recycling and overall less demand for copper, relative to the counterfactual, that is that we do not have such big efforts or such policies as Peter was suggesting we should put in place. And against this force that actually reduces the demand for copper, there is a global need to decarbonize and the consequent importance of the electricity sector. And this implies an increasing demand for copper. So these countervailing forces are acting, and as Rob mentioned at the beginning, the final result of that will be that demand for resources, raw materials will increase, and in particular for copper will increase, even though less significantly maybe than expected a few years ago. There's also supply drivers. So we have demand on one side, and then we have supply. And what is affecting supply? Well, green copper and decarbonization. There is a need to produce copper, or there are forces that are actually demanding something called green copper. I'll just mention what that means in a second. This green copper may command a price premium, so that might be interesting. And it also mentioned that 64% of copper CO2 emissions in Chile come from electricity. So any action we take in terms of moving towards green copper, understood green copper as a copper that uses less CO2 intensive resources, would be useful in terms of reducing our CO2 emissions. So we have basically two drivers, and the question that we address is how these two interact in the case of Chile. And just to mention, in terms of green copper, what are the attributes? Basically, these six. I'm not going to go into detail. Of course, there's a recent document on green copper in Chile that just came out, and which Eduardo Vitran participated. And basically, we have low global and local emissions are the key attributes, one of the key attributes of green copper. Also intensive use of low emission renewable energy. There are others, low waste, circular production systems, etc., but I will be concentrating on those two. So we have demand drivers. So the question is, what's happening with demand? Supply drivers aiming at producing green copper and decarbonization. And so our question is, how could the future demand for green copper in a more circular world play out for a copper producing country like Chile? So in specific, what is the expected demand for green copper from Chile? And related to demand, of course, the production, how much will we be able to produce and sell? What are the likely economic, social, and environmental impacts of switching to green copper, moving from counterfactual, which is producing copper as we produce it today, to producing it greener? What we understand for greener copper here is basically, as I was saying, moving towards, in this case, electricity generated by renewable resources. That's what we will be understanding in this specific analysis as switching to green copper. And very briefly, some policy recommendations. Okay, so we have the model, the baseline, the economic impacts of green copper, and a brief discussion. Sorry about that in Spanish. The EcoGem model is an applied, so what did we do to evaluate, to assess the impact? We use a general equilibrium model called the EcoGem Chile model. This is a dynamic general equilibrium model based on the OECD country model developed a long time ago, and that we have been maintaining updated for the case of Chile. And a key issue is that to generate credible results, the baseline must reflect what sectoral specialists in energy and mining estimate will happen in each of these sectors. Models are just as good as the data you put into them. And so what is key is that as I say, the baseline, whatever is projecting into the future, makes sense for policymakers in the mining and energy sector in this case. So what does the model do? It basically has a whole host of sectors, different sectors. I'm just going to call your attention to the power generation sector. We have opened it up into different sectors for generating electricity, clean and dirty. Then we have labor sectors, basically 40 labor sectors, male, female, rural, urban, and 10 different occupational categories. So we have results for that, 10 deciles of income, different pollutants, in particular air and CO2, which we have been careful in how we estimate it. We work with different trade partners, and of course, different types of taxes and transfers that can be applied. So the model basically considers all these types of elements. And also an important point here is that any sector, for example, imagine that production here is copper. What we have is copper being produced with different combinations of inputs. And the important thing is that electricity and between electricity, we can basically substitute different types of resources, of sources. there's an exogenous data requirement, so the model works with a base year social accounting matrix and with projections of what GDP growth rate will be, population growth rates, labor force growth rates will be. Using these inputs, we get results. Basically, we apply a policy to the model and we get macroeconomic, sectoral, distributive, and energy environmental impacts. So to get credible results, we have to build a credible baseline, basically a credible copper production path up to 2050 and a credible electricity generation matrix up to 2050. To do this, we do what's called a soft link, basically. So we take the macroeconomic model, we look at the sectoral energy model, the copper demand models that exist, and we link them with that, and all these are based on different variables. We try to relate them so that they are the same. For example, GDP growth are the same in the macroeconomic and the sectoral energy models. And based on that, we get the macroeconomic CG model linked to sectoral and copper demand, i.e. the results of each of these inputs are similar. And so the macroeconomic model gives outputs that are similar both to the sectoral energy model and to the copper demand model. And we apply this and generate a copper production baseline. If there is any expert in copper sector hearing us, well, this is what we project will be the demand for copper, the production of copper. Expert opinion, Chilean copper production will increase by 54% in 2050 relative to 2020. Okay, so that's what's expected up to 2050. And then there's an electricity generation baseline, where basically what we see here is that in blue and green, all of the increase in energy in the baseline is based on solar and wind in Chile for the future. And there's also a phasing out of coal in orange included in the modeling process. And so what are the impacts using this baseline of moving to green copper? Two simultaneous shocks are evaluated. A move to green copper production, that's the first shock. So we assume an electricity generating matrix that is roughly the same. Copper sector demands a higher share of clean electricity. That's key. So copper sector demands a higher share of clean electricity. So out of the total generation of electricity, whatever is clean is taken up by the copper sector. And any increase in electricity demand due to the increase in the copper sector production is satisfied by solar power. There will be a price premium for green copper. That's a second shock. So two basic shocks. One shock in in production, and a second shock in that there will be a price premium, 5% price premium. We can discuss that where that comes from, but we assume that that's a generally reasonable price premium for green copper versus normal copper. And so what are the results? We can see that there are macroeconomic impacts relating to this. I would just show one here, which is basically GDP. We see that GDP is positively affected. Of course, we are selling copper at a higher price. And there is we have the impact on the copper production. So instead of producing this baseline that we had before, we will be producing more since the price is higher. And the question is, will there be enough green copper demand here? The circularity comes in. Will there be enough green copper demand? And we use the OECD report actually to look at and see, and we see what the demand from OECD countries and China's, the demand from OECD countries is about 8,000 tons. And as we see here, the total number goes to 10,000 tons of production in the case of 250 in Chile. So we also will need not only to sell to the European, North American, Japan, and Korea market, but also we'll have to add part of our green copper will have to be demanded by China production. For example, for vehicle production, they will demand 4,626, that gives 12,000. So there will be, it's tight, but there probably will be enough green copper demand according to those numbers. Apparently, yes. Okay. Another important point, and the reason we use this type of modeling is because we can see that copper sector wins. Yes, here we see this. Up in 2050, copper sector increases its production. by 8.53 billion relative to the baseline, but there are sectors that lose due to the fact that the exchange rate actually goes down, right? As more dollars are available. So some export sectors lose. So that's an interesting policy concern when we use this type of, so when we move towards green copper in this case, we have to be careful if there's a price premium that there might be losing sectors that we might have to take some additional policies to take that into consideration. There are also indirect and direct copper sector emissions. Here we have the indirect emissions from the electricity sector in orange. What will be the shock? Of course, the emissions go down because we set up the model like that. If we did nothing, the blue line would be what would have happened. But as production goes up, direct emissions of the copper sector will go up. So what is the total? So we have indirect emissions going down, but direct emissions going up. What is the total? Total copper and sector and national level emissions. We see that total copper sector emissions will actually not be reduced, even though we are producing cleaner energy copper through cleaner energy, because we are producing more copper and processes and transport still emit. Total CO2 emissions in Chile actually do not change much, because what we're doing is switching the use of clean energy, right? So copper is taking the clean energy, and other sectors have to use whatever non-clean energy we are producing. Conclusions: despite the increase in circularity in the mining sector, demand for copper, and specifically green copper, will increase, with the latter commanding an expected price premium of 5%, and there probably will be demand for Chilean green copper. The macroeconomic impacts of a move to green copper are mixed. GDP increases, some sectors lose. It is necessary to examine differential regional impacts, emissions are not, total CO2 emissions are not affected, even though copper sector emissions are reduced. It is key, therefore, to examine quicker phase out of coal power plants, reduction in process and transport emissions as complements to this move. Thank you very much. That's my presentation.
Thank you very much, Raúl. Your presentation posed many other discussions, and one that is important to discuss in the future is how we are going to get the price premium in the context that the Latin American countries exporting raw materials usually are price takers, and the other thing that we might think in the future, particularly in the countries that are copper producers and mineral producers, is that in the future probably we will have more some of the raw materials, such as the copper, outside of the mining. I mean, in the circular economy of the world, and we might need to, let's say, to dig less. So let's go to the last presentation of this panel. We come back to the European Union. The European Union, you might know that they have a circular economy action plan, and there is a subtitle of this action plan that I like a lot. Is for a more cleaner but also competitive Europe. And this word of competition is very important if we want to apply the circular economy in Latin America. Maria Madrid is International Relations Officer in charge of the Latin American and the Caribbean. She works in DG Environment at the European Commission, and he holds a Master in European Judicial Studies. So Maria, you have the floor to tell us about how thinks the European Commission on circular economy.
Thank you so much, Carlos. And I will concentrate the presentation more on the global agreement on plastics, because I'm actually replacing my colleague Christopher Westley, who, as we speak, is traveling back from the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee, short INC, on plastics pollution, which took place from the 28th of November to the 2nd of December in Punta del Este in Uruguay.
With so very few results, I might say.
Yeah, but still, so this is fresh news. So I would like to thank you first for the opportunity to speak here and to listen to the very interesting presentations. And I would like to concentrate just on the INC and also the outlook. The next slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. To put it into context, well, almost 3 years ago, on the 11th of December 2019, the Commission presented the European Green Deal, which is, as you know, a roadmap for making the European Union's economy sustainable and to turn climate and environmental challenges into opportunities and making the transition just and fair. The Circular Economy Action Plan is an essential part of the Green Deal, and there in this case, we find the European Strategy for Plastics, which is a cornerstone of the Circular Economy Action Plan. So multiple efforts on plastics have been done in the EU, but the international aspect is essential as the plastics economy is a global economy. So what has been the EU doing globally besides the INC, which I mentioned, is we, of course, cooperate with the Global Alliance on Circular Economy and Resource Efficiency, GACERE. We have partnerships with third countries and green alliances, as with Japan, for example. And we are an observer and strategic partner to the Latin American Circular Economy Coalition. We have also circular economy missions, and I remember that Chile was actually the first country back in 2016, and we see now that Chile has gone a very long way. The next slide, please. Yes, as regards the process towards the negotiations, well, plastics received an increasing political attention, and many countries, including also in Latin America, are doing much, in particularly on single-use plastics, clean up and waste legislation. There are also multiple efforts at regional and international level, and the EU has passed key legislation as well, such as the waste directive on the packaging waste directive, which was adopted last week, and the single-use plastics directive, extended producer responsibility, then new product legislation, guidelines also on recycling, on design criteria, on the framework on bioplastics, and in future also microplastics legislation. So in the triple planetary crisis that we are facing, so climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution, plastics are a huge polluter, and we need urgently more action. The next slide, please. At the 5th session of the United Nations Environmental Assembly, we saw that business as usual is not an option, as it was already mentioned in former presentations. So even with existing policies and initiatives, the annual flow of plastics entering our oceans will triple within 2040. And the expert group under the UNEA called for urgent action and pointed to different responses. So we had there a momentum for the new global agreement on plastics. In spring this year, EU diplomacy played a key role in reaching an agreement to launch negotiations on a legally binding global agreement on plastics pollutions. So the mandate includes the setup of the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee that aims at developing an international legally binding instrument on plastic pollution by 2024, based on a comprehensive approach that addresses the full life cycle of plastics from the product design to waste. And this received a broad support. Next slide, please. So what happened now at the INC, the first meeting? It was held in hybrid form and gathered 160 countries and over 400 stakeholders and international organizations. As Carlos already mentioned, well, it could have been better, but well, the INC was also overshadowed by Russia and its war in the Ukraine, and also organizational matters. Only the chair was elected, so Peru and Ecuador. There was no consensus on the Bureau, no decision on rules of procedure, but it gave already a space for preliminary views and expectations on the future agreement, so on its scope, objectives, and means of implementation. So the discussions that developed showed general support for developing an ambitious and effective instrument consisting of globally binding provisions, including product restrictions, phase out of problematic and unnecessary plastics, such as single-use plastics and hazardous chemical additives, by ensuring the full cycle approach and the circularity of plastics. There was also strong support for upstream measures, including sustainable productive design, and combined also with transparency along the whole product value chain. So we would like to thank Chile also for its active and constructive participation, also even in co-drafting the resolution. The next steps will be that we shall receive an options paper from the Secretariat with potential elements to be considered in the new instrument. On the next slide, please. As regards the expectations, well, the global agreement on plastics production remains a high priority for the EU and also its member states. And we see it as a unique opportunity for the circular economy to go global and to demonstrate its potential in solving plastic pollution, which heavily contributes to the triple planetary crisis. The EU will stay active all throughout the process and also intersessionally, but other policies and initiatives need to continue, and we need an urgent, active and long-term solutions. So the next INC will take place on the week of the 22nd of May in France. And the next slide, please. Thank you and gracias for your attention.
Thank you very much, Maria, and thank you for bringing the attention to this meeting to discuss the treaty on plastic. The truth is something that hopefully may happen, but it's going to be hard to deliver. So meanwhile, we have to work in circular economy tools and applications at the country level and hopefully at the regional level. I will send two questions to the panel. The first one I already mentioned, which was the relation between circular economy and environmental, social, and governance initiative applied to the organizations, and I will open for any of the panelists to answer. And the second one is made just directly to Peter. So it's focused in the change in the consumer, in the consumer's behavior, and which is, in your opinion, the most appropriate instrument. So we might start by Peter because it's a direct questions, and thereafter 1 minute, and thereafter I open for the rest.
Thank you, and thanks for the interesting questions. I actually tried to respond to them in the chat already, but I'm happy to elaborate just slightly more. So on the first question about ESG, I think that companies are really waking up very quickly now to the circular economy issue. There are a lot of companies that try to be really at the forefront of this with respect to their business objectives and commitments that they make. A lot of them actually band together in the Ellen MacArthur Foundation and show some leadership. At the OECD, we have a tool that's called Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises, which has also an environment chapter. And this chapter is currently being reviewed, and circular economy objectives are being built into that chapter. So basically the environment chapter is being updated, and there's now better recognition, or it's going to be better recognition of the circular economy there. We also do have, and that's linked to the guidelines, due diligence guidance for responsible business conduct for specific sectors, such as garment and footwear, as well as the extractive sector, for instance. And also there you will find some guidance in terms of what can be considered, best practices with respect to circular economy. So that was my response to the first question. The second question, which was, which economic instruments are particularly effective in helping change consumer behavior. So there, let me just make a general comment, which is to say that if price levels or tax levels, charges are set at the right level, then they really have a major impact on consumer behavior. And just two examples there. One, of course, is probably quite well known, which is pay-as-you-throw charges, which are being used at the level of municipalities in quite a lot of places. And they have really, the empirical evidence there is very thick to show that they have a major effect in encouraging households to much better separate their waste into recyclable and non-recyclable. And the other example I want to give is, taxes and charges on single-use carrier bags, which are also very widespread and which have proven, again, if set at the right level, and if embedded into a broader set of policies that also addresses alternatives to single-use carrier bags, plastic bags, then they are really very effective in encouraging people to completely do away with single-use items, single-use bags, and switch to reusable ones instead. So those are just two examples I wanted to give.
Thank you very much, Peter. I don't know if somebody wants to answer the first question. I think we have to arrange another webinar on due diligences, particularly the impacts of Latin America of the new regulation of the European Union and some other European countries. But this is for another day. And in relation of the price thing, it is important to consider the substitution elasticities, because otherwise it will penalize the consumer. Any other?
Yes, I have just relating to the first one, right?
Yes.
I think that's an important point in the paper that we developed. As the paper suggests, even if one sector moves towards being greener, as ESG would suggest, that doesn't necessarily mean that the country will actually benefit in terms of overall reductions. In particular, if as in the case of copper, what is happening is that they are taking a larger share of the relatively constant green energy that is generated. So the rest have to use non-green energies. And so it is very important to make sure that the ESG individual initiatives talk and work together with national level policies. For example, phasing out, as we were suggesting, quicker dirty energy and cleaner, more expensive energy being paid for by, for example, the copper sector, not at the current price, but at a higher price, for example. Or it is also necessary to work on complementary policies that are not so evident, such as transport and process emissions. I know that the mining sector is working on this type of initiatives, but we have to make it quicker to make sure that we actually do advance in reducing our environmental footprint. You are muted.
Thank you, Raul. Yeah. Tomás, you have a question, just 1 minute, but it says that according to the 4 pillars that you name it in the roadmap, which is the more complex to carry on and to go ahead?
Thank you for the question. That's very difficult to answer. But if I had to take a guess, I would name the territories pillar, because of the wide diversity of territories that you find in Chile, right? On that pillar, the challenge is to make sure that the circular economy is not an issue of just the metropolitan region of Chile. As you know, Chile is a very centralized country, so it's very easy, or it often happens that policies are thought of thinking of the metropolitan region and not necessarily the regions. So I think that's very challenging to make sure all regions in Chile and all municipalities get in line with this agenda. I would name that as the most challenging issue.
Thank you very much, Thomas. I see Rob with the raised hand. I don't know if he wants to make a 1-minute intervention, and we close for a coffee.
Let me change that into a 30-second question and hopefully a 30-second answer for Raul. Raul had a question on your presentation. I saw that you don't get any CO2 emission reductions in Chile from your policy, but of course you're gifting green copper to the world. You're exporting more green copper. So is there a significant CO2 reduction abroad that could help sell this policy?
Well, but the green copper is in production, right? I don't know. I'm not sure I can answer that, because the copper, so to produce high-grade copper, right, from what we are exporting, I mean, the foundries would not change, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not exactly sure how to answer that question, except one of the things we are suggesting is that green copper would allow, for example, the production of cars that have a lower carbon footprint, right? And yes, so that's a hard question. I don't know. I don't know how to answer your question, actually. I mean, and so basically that's true. So we could gain there. And the other point is that this 5% number that we presented on the price premium relates to the carbon border adjustment mechanism, right? That is being proposed by the European Union. And so basically the idea there is that the copper that is being produced as it is being cleaner, we would assume it has less carbon in its production, and as a result of that, it will be able to go into the European Union, paying a lower price or carbon tax, if you want. I'm not sure if I answered your question, actually.
Well, thank you very much.
This is a country model. This is not a world model, of course.
Yes, you may discuss in the coffee, although the model is, I mean, the green copper is through the production, not the transport or the demand. So external emissions are not considered. So we have 5 minutes to take a break to get a coffee. Fortunately, you can bring to your desk instead of not allowing to enter in the room with the coffee. So in 5 minutes at 11 sharp, we meet again.
Okay.
Thank you very much, and applause for you.
Thank you, Carlos.
Which market, which country will reach? You know, Chile will go mostly mainly to Europe, I imagine, if it's green copper.
Yes.
Well, that's our assumption is exactly that it will be OECD countries buying green copper at a price premium, plus maybe the Chinese market needing to export certified cars towards developed markets. Yeah, I mean, that's anybody's guess. I mean, of course, we need a world model for that, Rob, which we're not using. We're using a Chile model.
We have a world model.
I know.
So let's talk again.
I don't know if we should start. I think we should. So I am the moderator. Is everybody hearing me now? Yes? Yes, okay. So, well, good morning again. We'll move into the third part of our seminar, which is key long-term consequences of transitioning to a circular economy. And we have very relevant presenters. I will start with Rob DeLink. As we've suggested, he is the coordinator, coordinator of modeling and outlooks at the Environment and Economic Integration Division of the OECD Environment Directorate. If you want to add anything to that, Rob, please go ahead. So the floor is yours. I will raise my hand when you have basically 1 minute left.
Thanks, Raul. I might not see your hand if I'm in presentation mode, but by all means start shouting and I'll stop talking. So yeah, no, let's see, I want to share my presentation. There you go. So what I did in the opening was kind of, very quick broad strokes on what happens to circular economy. And what I want to present in this session is first a little bit of a deeper dive in what drives the change in materials use over time, and then also look at the consequences of some policy action. So first, back to our global material resources outlook. And the basic concepts of increased materials use can be shown here. This is for the United States. You have a growth, a fairly stable growth in GDP. And of course, as you grow GDP, you need more investment. So gross investment in trillions of dollars is increasing over time at a steady pace. That leads to an increase in demand for construction. So construction grows, and with construction growth comes construction materials use growth. So this is just one example of how we come from a very generic GDP growth towards very specific sectoral details on the use of materials. This is from a baseline that was created before the COVID-19 pandemic. So nowadays we would see more of a dip there in 2020, but it is still the general long-term concepts are the same. So compare that to China, where you currently have a very high GDP growth rate, but it's rapidly coming down in the coming decades. And in the very long term, we even see it lower than the US growth rate. So what happened there in investment is, again, you start off from a higher base, but it's leveling off as China has basically is reducing its growth rate and it's more stabilizing in its infrastructure. And what happens in the US, why the US is then increasing more rapidly than in China, is that in the US there's much more of a replacement investment in infrastructure than in China, because the stock of infrastructure is much older in the US than in China. So you see these two coming closer together, and with that comes construction outputs and also construction materials use. So what we actually see is for the US a moderate growth rate in construction materials use, and in China it's curvy, but basically we can say it's roughly constant, but it's constant at a very high level. Then compare that to sub-Saharan Africa, where we currently have relatively low growth rates, but because they are further from their GDP potential, our projections suggest that economic growth rates will increase over time. So you're going to a phase where you start off slow and then you're increasing more rapidly. So if we translate that into gross investments, you start off from a very low base, but with a rapid growth rate. So they are catching up basically in investment levels to where the US is now. But of course, that is only by 2060. Same then for construction output, starting from a very low base, but going to a very high, through a very high growth rate. But because the base is so low, the construction materials use is actually by 2060 not much higher than in the US. So basically, it is a high growth, but high growth in itself doesn't say much. You need to combine high growth with what the base level is to figure out what happens in the long run. Then on the idea of structural change and the idea that we're shifting away from materials intensive sectors. These are sectors in the economy. This is for the global economy. This is materials used per ton, per dollar of output. So the tons of materials used per dollar of output. And you see a high materials use in construction, food, iron and steel, electricity and utilities. Now, of course, this is again in volumes. So this includes the sand, gravel and crushed rock in equal weights as rare earth elements. But under that metric, you see that construction is the most materials intense sector. And by 2060, all sectors are able to reduce materials use per unit of output. So basically, we're adding more capital, adding more labor, more value added to production to generate more output with the same materials use or less materials used per unit of output. So we have a reduction in materials intensity in all sectors, and that is good, of course, for materials use. But on top of that, we see that there is growth, primarily most fast growth in those sectors that have a low materials intensity. So within each sector, a shift towards less materials intensity, but moreover, a shift from more materials intense to less materials intense sectors in the economy. And those two then combine to reduce the overall materials intensity of the macroeconomy more rapidly than what you see at the sector level. Now, compensating this somewhat is the shift in economic activity across regions. Because what happens is also that we have economic activity shifting mostly towards emerging economies and later developing economies. And what you saw in the previous slide on the emerging economies is that when you have faster growth in emerging economies, that tends to lead to an increase in materials use because materials use is associated with industrialization and a rapid construction. So there's all these shifts that are going on inside the economy, and some of them mean a bigger scale of materials use, but at the same time, a more efficient use and also a shift towards less materials intensity. That doesn't mean that environmental problems are getting smaller. No, doubling of materials use means grosso modo that also the greenhouse gas emissions related to materials management will more than double. I've already in my opening started talking about all kinds of other pollution issues. And of course, those also increase rapidly if we don't act more. So what then happens if we do use economic instruments to try and reduce materials use? So here we have a scenario, and it's a fairly hypothetical scenario, I would say. It's a purely fiscal scenario with a materials tax on virgin material, a subsidy to secondary metal production, and a subsidy for recycling. So these together are fiscal instruments that try to shift away from virgin materials use and boost secondary material use and recycling. Then if you look at it, what happens there, and we show here employment, GDP, and materials intensity. So let's start looking at the blue bars, which is employment. And on the left, in the rectangle are the results for Chile. So we see a tiny increase in employment in Chile, and at the same time, a small reduction in GDP. And that's basically what we see in most or all regions. There's a cost involved in this policy, and that cost means lower overall economic activity, but it shifts towards sectors that are less materials intense, and the sectors that are less materials intense tend to be more labor intense. So you're shifting basically the burden of your fiscal system away from cleaner and more labor intensive sectors towards dirtier sectors that use a lot of materials and not a lot of labor. So basically you're putting less of a punishment on labor and more of a punishment on dirty production. So these can boost employment and reduce GDP. At the reduction of GDP, that's very small, but you see a very sizable reduction in materials use. skip that part. So what happens between the different materials? First one on the left, the panel is distinguishing between metals and minerals. And we see a much larger reduction in metals used than in minerals used. And the reason for that is fairly simple, and that is for metals, we have secondary markets. We have scrap that we can use to then replace the virgin material. But think about, again, my now overused perhaps example of construction materials. Building regulations in most countries prevent the use of recycled building materials in construction of new buildings. So what happens to demolition rubble is that you cannot use it to make new buildings, so it cannot replace building materials in buildings construction, but rather it's then downgraded to road filler, which loses a lot of the value and goes against the circularity concept of maintaining value. But it also means that we cannot as easily substitute away from the non-metallic minerals as easily as for metals, where you have functioning secondary markets. So on the right-hand panel, we see this shift from primary to secondary markets in this scenario. Now, this scenario is a fairly pragmatic scenario, I would say, and based on what we think is plausible and reasonable to assume in countries. This is not based on how do we get fully circular. This scenario doesn't get to a fully circular economy, but you do see the mechanisms here that you get an increase in secondary production in basically all sectors. The example here that I wanted to highlight is iron and steel, where you have actually already fairly established international markets for scrap and therefore for secondary steel. And there you see that the share in the business as usual is already fairly large, but then also the scope for reduction is fairly limited. Copper, on the other hand, we see very little secondary copper on the markets right now, so there will be more room for increasing the share of secondary copper. This comes with an employment gain, as I just said, but one thing to keep in mind is that when you look at this at the level of individual sectors, what you see is, as we expect, you see a reduction in jobs in primary metals, in minerals, and in construction, because those will be negatively affected by the fiscal reform. And you see an increase in secondary metals jobs. And the increase there is roughly offsetting the decrease in the primary sector. So basically, if you count green jobs, as we actually normally are defined, you have the reduction in the brown jobs that is roughly compensated by an increase in the green jobs. But there's a second effect, and that is more important, and that's where the net job gains are really concentrated, and that's in the services sectors. So basically, the fiscal reform not only moves people from primary to secondary sectors, it also increases the overall labor chances in other sectors, and especially in services. So this is a kind of a hidden job gain, I always call it, because you don't see these directly coming. If you do a circular economy roadmap, you don't immediately see an increase in services sectors jobs, because they're not directly stimulated by the policies, but they will be there, and they will be significant for overall employment levels. And then finally, international trade can play a significant role in reducing global materials use. Yes, we need to reduce the scale of virgin materials use. We need to use them also more efficiently, but also we can change our production patterns to shift production towards regions where production is more efficient. And we can also change our value chains in a way across regions to contribute to materials. But not all regions are equally efficient at producing products with low materials use. So if you source more from regions that are more efficient, you can actually get a global gain in terms of reducing materials use without sacrificing global production of the commodity. And I'll leave it there for this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rob. It was a very interesting presentation, and we'll leave the time for the questions at the end. Now, let me see, I got most of it here. Here we go. So our next presentation moves us into Latin America, and this is a circular economy in Latin America and the Caribbean, an opportunity for a transformative recovery by Carlos de Miguel. As you have said, a very good friend, a very good environmental economist, and who is currently in ECLAC. So please, Carlos.
Thank you very much, Raul. I will share my presentation now. Okay, so you probably are watching the presentation. The first thing that I have to say is that we have been discussing this morning about circular economy, and there are some words that we usually repeat, which is reducing waste, increase efficiency in energy, materials, well, in everything, which are things that in the environmental economics are not new. Indeed, I will say that they are from the 60s, paying our attention to the economy. The other thing that is important is that if we are failing to do that, it means that the incentives are not aligned, and also that the producers and consumers, the polluter and consumer pay principle is not being properly applied. So this is a call of attention that if we want to have a serious change to circular economy, we have to do, let's say, stronger policies in that direction. In terms of circular economy, you know probably this draw, which is a modification of the Ellen MacArthur. In worldwide, there is, applications of circular economy from the design to the end of their life. But when you come to Latin America, you have to think in other things. The first one is that in Latin America, still we produce less waste than in another region. In general terms, we produce half of our waste is organic, and the other thing that is a problem in Latin America is that more than 40% of the waste is not properly well disposal. So still we have, let's say, kind of middle income, less developed problems, and still we will have a problem that a lot of type of waste will increase because we are well below of the rates of the OECD countries. So we have a room to do the things right now to not reach the rates that developed countries they have in the production of waste of different materials. Obviously, what matters is to apply good incentives, have information system, training and research, but we have to focus in the whole change. Circular economy is an approach. It can be approached to a country, to a sector, to a company. So it is important to get involved in this philosophy. And in ECLAC, we consider circular economy as one of the main areas of work for the transition to a more developed countries in Latin America. As I was saying, and you have an overview of the situation of Latin America, in the case of the production of waste, we are well below, but also we are well below in the recycling in comparison with the OECD countries. There are variations among the countries, but it seems that we produce less waste, but we don't recycle anything. Indeed, we disposal improperly in the most of the countries. Chile might be a kind of exception, and also Colombia, but in general terms, there is a room for improvement in the recycling part of the circular economy, and there is an economic value of many of the products that can be recycled. The other thing when we think in circular economy in Latin America is that this approach should help us not only to reduce emissions and waste, but also to create economic development, to reduce poverty, and also to close the external gap. And what I mean by the external gaps, if you see the current accounts of Latin America, usually we export raw materials, particularly in South America, we import the rest, and we have current account imbalance, and sometimes time to time a financial crisis. So any policy that we have to put in place should consider that we need to grow, and this you have these 4 gaps. The gap that is above the 4% means that if we want to avoid poverty in the region and to reduce the number of the poors in the region, we need to grow at a rate of 4%. But if we want to achieve the nationally determined contributions, the one that has been updated recently, we cannot grow. We cannot grow at the rate of 4%. Indeed, we have to decrease our growth, and this is because we are very coupled in terms of emissions, greenhouse emissions, and other type of emissions. So we have a problem here. We need structural changes, because if we want to achieve the growth consistent with the Paris Agreement and the national contributions of the region, we will not grow enough to destroy the poverty, the poverty gap. But indeed, in the region, as I was telling to you, if we grow exporting raw materials and importing the rest, we will have a limit that is inconsistent with the external balance. And this limit is a rate, depending on the countries, from 0.9 to 2.1. It means that even if we don't do anything in environmental terms, we cannot grow at the rate that we need to avoid poverty. So circular economy is something that we can do to grow more in a better way, which means with more national content and regional content, and also be consistent with the limits of the Paris Agreement. We have made some exercises applied, in this case, input-output matrices, not so sophisticated as the CG modeling, but we know that if we reduce plastics, metals, building materials, or petroleum in a lower rates, we can increase GDP, we can increase net employment. In general terms, we might reduce emissions. It depends on the energy matrix. And this exercise showed that in the region, to apply this type of policies will have the 3 benefits: social, environmental, and economic. The results usually are lower than for Europe, and in many cases depends on the energy matrix that we have in the Latin American countries. But when we focus only on waste and recycling sector, which is something that we can do in Latin America, is a real problem. There is a lot of informality in this sector in the economies of Latin America, probably in Chile less again, but in the rest of the region is very high, the level of informality in the labor market of recycling and waste management. But if we do this, the assessment of how is the behavior of this sector in connection with the rest of the sectors of the economy, what we are realizing is this sector is very connected with the rest of the sector domestically. Indeed, it's a sector that imports less things than the rest of the sectors of the economy. Therefore, if we improve this sector, we will reduce our imports from the economy, and we will focus more in domestic production. So the interlinkages of this sector with the local economies are higher than the average of the economies. And what we have estimated is that if we raise the increase of recycling of several economies of Latin America to reach the rates of Germany, what we have is we have very good direct and indirect linkages in the economy. But in the case of the Latin American countries, usually this sector is quite independent of the rest of the economy. What means that recycling should be connected with the manufacturer sectors. So we develop industry towards the recycling, and also the inputs that this sector is requiring needs to be developed in our countries. Otherwise, it will be, again, an independent sector that is growing, but still we want a key sector that has interlinkages with the rest of the economy, upstream and downstream. And our estimations on this, if we reach the rates of Germany in terms of recycling, we will create almost 500,000 jobs and a rise of 0.35% of GDP. Policies matter, and to do that, we need very, strong commitments for applying policies. And the truth is that in the region, many countries are applying some, roadmaps for circular economy. Chile was presented today, but also the rest, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, is still very focused in waste management and recycling, but still there is room, despite there is room for improvement, still there has been a lot of political movements, not only on the circular economy issue, but also addressing the plastic problems. There has been issued a lot of laws in different countries applying sometimes taxation or banning the plastics, different type of plastics, and there was mentioned the negotiation of the international treaty. But in the region, there are movements towards the circular economy. The other good thing in the region that might help is to connect waste and waste treatment with the nationally determined contribution for climate change. More and more, the countries of the region, particularly those that are updating the contributions, are connecting the options and the benefits of addressing the waste issue in terms of greenhouses reduction of emissions. The other thing that is important in terms of policy and where the region is progressing is in some of the policies and laws that we can apply to move forward in the circular economy, particularly in the extended production regulations. If you see, sorry for it is in Spanish, if you see, most of the countries has developed this type of regulations, but still there are some areas where has been no regulation, or very few countries have these regulations, such as, for example, the vehicles. And one thing that we are doing now, usually these laws are, taking advantage of the laws that has been already issued in developed countries. But if we move towards, for example, electromobility, we have to start thinking is this type of laws, for example, for the batteries of lithium, and extending these regulations to the new ways of developments applied in circular economy. Just 2 slides quickly. Circular economy is not just it is recycling, but sometimes it's a new use of the things. So, for example, in electromobility, the retrofitting policies and that this could be a solution for the transition to electromobility while we start producing electrical cars in the region. It's cheaper right now and could be a phase in the transition, but you need again regulation for that. And finally, just one concern. Circular economy does not mean to have a kind of circular transport of the materials around the globe several times. So, for example, and this slide to show the example, if we produce lithium and the batteries are produced in China or in Asia, and we consume the cars in Latin America, but also in other developed countries, what we are doing, maybe we can be very efficient and are using less resources, but we are, making a kind of circular economy that means that we transport everything through the globe several times. So one of the important things of circular economy for us is that you develop industries to make circular economy within the region and within the countries to avoid this long circularity of the materials. Just ending, I will say that circular economy have employment multipliers, have very good spillover effects, interlinkages with the economy, particularly recycling, the recycling sector. It is important to continue developing the roadmaps national circularity that we are developing in some countries of Latin America and expanding, particularly the standard producer responsibility laws or the public procurement, and especially the fiscal policies. On the contrary of the standard producer responsibility laws, the fiscal policies, there is a big room for improvement. Chile now make a kind of subsidy. No, it's not a subsidy, sorry, it's an exception of taxation for the electrical vehicles, but it might be this type of movements for efficiency in materials use or in energy. And this type of incentives should be applied not only for big companies, but also small companies and the consumers. And hopefully we will develop some enabling regulatory frameworks at the national level, because still there are very few and specific actions, but needs a kind of global and integrated approach. So this is the presentation. Thank you very much, Raul.
Thank you very much, Carlos. Very interesting on how the need to address the trade-offs between growth, employment, environment, and specifically the issues of income distribution in our developing Latin American countries, key concerns for all of us. Finally, Peter Borghi will present OECD Global Plastics Outlook. Peter Borghi has been working for 20 years on international local environmental policy issues. He is currently in the OECD Environment Directorate, primarily working on issues related to water, business and environment, and its infrastructure finance. He's also leading now the work on waste management and resource productivity, with a strong focus on resource efficiency and the circular economy. So Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Raul. And as I may say, we're going full circle because I'm with this presentation, I'm actually going to dovetail and link to what Maria was explaining about the international negotiations around Global Plastics Treaty. That, by the way, I also attended in Punta del Este just last week, and I think Maria gave us a very good account of what happened there. So thanks to her. What I will present is actually the result of several years of work of a rather large team here at the OECD. Rob, who's on the call, was part of that team, of course, but also a number of other colleagues. What we did is that we developed two global plastics outlooks. You can see them here on the slide, the covers. The first one was basically looking at establishing past trends and developing the current situation and putting together a lot of data into a coherent framework and mapping the flow of plastics through the economy and into the environment. The second report was then basically building on that work and projecting those trends into the future, including with different policy scenarios. So go to my next slide. So I will start by telling a little bit about where we are coming from and where we are, and then talking about the projections. And I think I can go reasonably quickly here on the first few slides because Rob already introduced some of them in his presentation earlier. So what you can see here is, of course, the almost exponential increase in the use of plastics globally, and how it's distributed over different regions. I think what's maybe important here, and just go through a few clicks, is the sheer magnitude of this material consumption. So the amount of plastics that we consume annually, or that we consumed in 2019, was essentially equivalent to the weight of more than 45,000 Eiffel Towers. And the growth in the use of plastics was 40% quicker than the growth in GDP over the last 20 years, essentially. It was a major emitter of greenhouse gas emissions, and our per capita plastics consumption per year in the OECD country, a group of countries, is more than 150 kilograms, while it's roughly 40 in non-OECD countries. So it's also, a big connection there between the level of development and household income, essentially, and the consumption of plastics. And that, of course, translates into waste. What is consumed in the economy at some stage becomes waste. In 2019, we generated 353 megatons of waste. And actually, when you look at the composition of that waste, what you can see is 40% is packaging, 12% is consumer products, and 11% is textiles. All of these are relatively short-lived products, particularly packaging, of course, which is sort of usually less than 6 months before it becomes waste. Consumer products a little longer, as well as textiles. And the rest are other applications that have a longer life, such as vehicles, such as other long-lived products. And so currently, more than half of plastic waste generated really comes from applications with lifetimes of less than five years. So we're turning these over into waste very quickly. And we're recycling very little, because what we established is that the plastic's life cycle is currently only 8% circular. So the problem then, of course, is not just that we generate the waste, but it's also that we are leaking quite a lot of plastics into the environment. And this is where we worked with some of the best scholars in this field to establish where in the environment what's leaked ends up. What you can see here is microplastic leakage, aquatic leakage, terrestrial leakage, open pit burning and dump sites, as well as leakage from marine activities. Actually, most of the attention has really focused on the aquatic leakage, which is here at roughly 6 megatons per year. I mean, you have to add the some of the microplastic leakage and some of the leakage from marine activities here. But if you compare this to what's actually leaked, into terrestrial systems, but also burnt, in open pits and simply dumped, is actually relatively little. So for the moment, we've really just looked at the tip of the iceberg. And one of the things that we've done with this report is that we've also attracted attention to some of the other mismanagement and leakage, that's actually also happening. But if you then look at aquatic leakage, you can also see that ultimately a relatively small share of the material ends up in the ocean, which is where most of the attention has focused, while most of it is really floating in rivers or sinking to river beds and lakes. And a significant buildup here below in the red box there, the accumulated stock of plastics in rivers and lakes at roughly 100 megatons. while you have a buildup of 30 megatons of plastics in oceans. So the global use of plastics, now I'm switching to projections, if nothing is done, is really projected to triple. This has already been presented by Rob, so I don't want to go into much detail here, but just to say maybe that growth rates are very different from one region to the next. Here at the top, you have mostly OECD countries in blue, different shades of blue, where you have roughly a doubling of consumption to 2060. But then when you look further below, you see countries such as India, regions such as Sub-Saharan Africa, where the growth rate is actually closer to 5. And so you have different growth rates, which are important to note in this context. All polymers are really projected to increase. And we've been able to map those in the model and then also to project them. And really all uses and all polymers increase. The shares remain similar between today and 2060. And you can see that the very significant applications remain in packaging, of course, which is where we have the quick turnover, but also in construction, where we have much more durable uses. So packaging, vehicles, and construction will essentially account for 2/3 of all uses in 2060. So in terms of waste management, the projections foresee that roughly 15% of waste will still be mismanaged in 2060. So actually the percentage is decreasing. Currently there's 22% of plastic waste that is mismanaged. This goes down to 15%, but in absolute terms, because of the quick growth of waste, we still have roughly a doubling of mismanaged waste. Similar story here for landfill, which is actually relatively stable, 49% currently, 50% in 2060, but a very huge increase in absolute terms of what needs to be landfilled. Incineration, roughly constant at a little less than 20%, but also an increase in absolute terms. And recycling a significant increase, doubling essentially, but still, of course, 70% recycling rate in 2060, insufficient to really make a major difference. So ultimately, the circularity of the plastics life cycle then only increases from currently 8% to 14% in 2060. And I see Raul already has his hand up, so I must be a little bit too slow here. So let me maybe just skip over this slide and tell you something about the policy scenarios that we developed. So we developed 2 policy scenarios to show how plastic pollution can be eliminated. One, which was a scenario that we called regional action scenario, that differentiated action regionally, and one that we call global ambition scenario, and where the ambition level was more aligned across regions. And let me focus on the second one, because that is the only one that really allows to eliminate plastic pollution by 2060. That's what you're going to see in the next slide. So in gray here, you see the current situation, 2019. In purple, you see the business as usual scenario, and in green you see the ambitious policy scenario. Blue is the regionally differentiated one. And so what you can see is that with an ambitious policy package, we can decrease global plastics use roughly by a third. Yeah, we're moving, I mean, first tripling, of course, in the business as usual scenario, and then decreasing roughly by a third in the ambitious scenario. Similar trend for plastic waste. And we also managed to reduce mismanaged plastic waste by roughly, 96%. And as a consequence, then also the plastic leakage to the environment by 85%. Just 6 megatons of leakage remaining, which is mostly microplastics, which we didn't put any policies to mitigate into the policy package, because essentially we don't know yet what policies are effective at achieving that goal. So the policy package that we used was really trying to do 3 things: restrain plastics demand and enhance circularity through a combination of a packaging tax, a tax on non-packaging items, and measures to improve eco-design and make products more durable, enhance recycling through increased recycling rates, increased recycled content rates through recycled content targets, and expanded use of extended producer responsibility. And finally, measures to close leakage pathways, essentially through investment to improve plastic waste collection and improved litter collection as well, mostly focused on fast developing countries. The cost that we estimated for this ambitious policy scenario is less than 1% of global GDP globally. But there are significant regional differences. And if you just look at the green one again, which is the ambitious policy scenario, the green bars here, you can see that the costs are relatively low in China and most OECD regions. And they are significantly larger, especially in Africa and other developing regions. Mostly driven by the significant investment costs that are needed in places that sort of start from a lower level of infrastructure development for waste collection. And so let me just skip the last slide and stop here. I just put the final takeaways here. I've said actually most of these things, and hand it back to Raul, and my apologies for going over time.
You're muted, Raul.
Thank you all. Thank you, Peter. Thank you all actually for very, very interesting presentations. We have a little less than 10 minutes before we move into the closing remarks. Are there any questions has anyone been monitoring the questions to see if we have any direct questions here? Let's see, 10:23, 10:43, 10:46. I think that was before the break. So we have an anonymous assistant here who's saying regulations need technical compliances of the national quality infrastructure, measurement, standardization, conformity, etc., for their implementation. What do the national roadmaps foresee for upgrading the NQI according to the requirements of a transition to a circular economy? Partially is a public issue and requires financial means. Some countries, for instance, Mexico, Argentina, and Colombia are doing something. But what does, for instance, Chile, which has a weak national metrology institute, measurement, not climate, in the form of a network that consists of private and public laboratories? Okay.
Raul, I can comment on that.
Sure.
So what I can say is that the last 2 or 3 years, we've been working with the Instituto Nacional de Normalización. I don't know how to translate that, but the National Metrology Institute, I guess, to develop technical norms for circular economy. We have projected their work, especially in the construction sector, and also technical norms for several applications of secondary materials that come from extended producer responsibility. This is not enough. This is just part of what needs to happen. We also need more laboratories that can make tests, and not just on the construction sector. There are other issues that will be in need of this. For instance, plastics. We have the single-use plastics law that mandates the creation of certified plastics, and for this we need not just technical norms but also laboratories that can do the tests. And also for compostability, we need the same. But this is the way we are approaching this, collaborating with the ENN.
Thank you very much. If there were no, I have actually questions. I'm not seeing any others. So one question for Rob, which was, you mentioned some economic instruments. I didn't see one of the things I mentioned was the CBAM, right? The carbon border adjustment mechanism as a mechanism to promote cleaner production and at least exports towards the European Union. I guess I was wondering what your thinking is on that as an instrument. And a question for Peter. You said the cost of better managing plastic is less than 1%. Everything is always less than 1% of GDP, it turns out. Anyway, but the costs are less than 1% of the global GDP. But then what are the benefits, right? So if you're thinking of an Africa that is, I saw the numbers, or sub-Saharan Africa is 2 to 3% of GDP. That's a big number, even if it's a small GDP. But there must be some benefits, right? So I was wondering if you've been working in that direction.
Shall I start with happily leaving the second one to Peter? On CBAM, it's complicated. I lead the work on trade and environment at the OECD, and it's always a contentious topic, which is one reason why we don't study it that much. There's a big difference between the idea of border carbon adjustment in general and the specific CBAM proposal as proposed by the EU. And I will definitely not comment on the specific EU proposal. In general, yes, you could imagine that you have border carbon adjustments for specific national policies, but actually the policies that we study here are global policies. So there would be no need for doing any action vis-a-vis competitors, either from a competitiveness perspective or from the perspective of avoiding leakage. So in principle, there's no need for such type of instrument if you have a global perspective. What we do in the plastics outlook is we have two scenarios. One where you have action, ambitious action in OECD countries, and one you have global ambitious action. Now in the one with action, with more regional action, we still have some action in non-OECD countries, which means that you're already putting some tax level in place in other countries to kind of avoid the whole idea of leakage or of the big shifts that you might get in production with hotspots for production of dirty materials, etc. So we circumvent that basically in our policy scenario, but that's also for political reasons, in the sense that it's very complicated instruments and that require really detailed studies and really specific investigation of how they are implemented to understand WTO compliance, but also their economic consequences. I've seen too many broad strokes academic literature that kind of tries to mimic it, but in such a simplistic way that it's politically not helpful, that I think if we wanted to do something like that, it would have to be a really in-depth study. But we are out of the time for that.
Thank you.
Raul, if I may, you put a question to me as well. Raul, can you hear me?
Yes. Yes,
Oh,
yes,
okay.
please, Peter. I'm sorry.
All right. Okay. No, I somehow was wondering. Anyway, no. Thanks for the question about the costs that seem to be low globally, but then quite high in some developing regions. I think my first response is, of course, we've only looked at the cost side of things. We haven't looked at the benefit side. And of course, by eliminating plastic pollution, there should be very significant benefits. But we haven't been able, and we haven't even attempted to actually assess and calculate those benefits. There would be, according to scientists, rather significant benefits for public health, as well as for the environment. I think on the public health side, there's quite a lot of data that could be used to assess, the benefits of elimination of plastic pollution. On the environment side, I think there's much more uncertainty and still a lot of scientific research needed to actually assess, the magnitude of the benefits, and then also monetize those benefits. So that's the reason, and I guess that needs to be made clear when we put those numbers forward. We're only looking at the costs. We're not looking at the benefits, and it's not like net costs or anything. It's gross, and that needs to be kept in mind. Of course, the fact that there is significant differentiation across regions, and that the costs are particularly high in developing regions, is essentially a strong plea for the need for financial transfers and development aid to be made available for those regions that have a larger burden. We actually just published a paper that is looking into the current state of official development assistance to address plastics. And that comes up with interesting insights in terms of where the aid is currently coming from, what magnitude it has, and whether it's actually going to places that are most in need in terms of being hotspots of plastic leakage into the environment. I can post just in a second a link to that paper in the chat. And while I have the floor, if I may pose a question to some of the other panelists or speakers, Raul, if you allow me that.
Yes, please.
First of all, I have a question to Thomas. I wanted to maybe ask him if he could outline, briefly, because I presented sort of the policy mix that we assumed in our global action scenario to eliminate plastic pollution, which consisted both of virgin plastic taxes and then also measures downstream. If Thomas could maybe comment on how that compares to the policy mix that the government in Chile is currently developing. And then I have a question for Carlos as well. And Carlos, you presented numbers on employment and GDP from improvements in waste management. So basically, if Latin America was reaching the same levels of recycling and waste management as Germany, I think was your benchmark. You showed quite significant improvements, job creation essentially. So I was just wondering, is this gross job creation or is it net job creation? I get a sense that it's probably gross, but if you could just specify that. Sorry for the lengthy intervention, Raul.
Okay. And you also have your hand up, Carlos. So when you answer, maybe I think you wanted to make a comment. Sorry, Thomas. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, just to answer the question that was directed to me by Peter. There's three main components of the current policy mix for plastics. One is the single-use plastics bags ban that was a law that was approved in the year 2018, if I remember correctly. And this is already law in Chile. Not everyone is complying, so I think the current challenge with this is to actually enforce the law. But this is part of the policy mix. Then we have the single-use plastics law that was approved last year, and this is quite ambitious. This is a law that is also in the process of being implemented. Not all aspects of the law are currently active. The law comes into full, I mean, all its articles become fully active next year, actually. And this law contains several things. First, it prohibits the use of single-use items, not just plastic items, but any material items. When you go to a restaurant or a cafe or a place that serves food, and you eat the food there. So single-use items, specific single-use items, right? The law contains a list, will not be allowed. Everyone will have to use reusable ware. And the law also mandates for when you prepare food to be eaten outside of the establishment, then it forbids the use of plastics, and it only allows the use of other materialities, or what the law calls certified plastics, which is plastic which is compostable on the one side, and also which has a determined amount of bio-based materials. So this is one aspect of the law, but the law also mandates a certain amount of reusable drinks. So establishments that sell drinks must at least sell 30% of drinks in reusable format. And the law also contains a disposition that mandates the use of recyclable plastics in bottles of beverages. So it establishes a calendar, and it starts with 15% of recycled plastics that must go into bottles. And then this keeps growing to, I think, 70% in the year 2060. So this is a large demand pool. And the third component of the policy mix for plastics is the EPR regulation for packaging, where plastics is one of the materials there, and there's specific goals for these materials in the domiciliary and in the non-domiciliary sectors. So I think these are the main components now, but we are also participating in the global talks for the plastics treaty, and surely new things will come from that.
Thank you, Thomas. Carlos?
Yes, first of all, a comment on the national quality infrastructure. Indeed, this is quite there is a room for improvement in the region, but not only at the country level, but also in the cooperation, because it is required to harmonize permits, to develop mutual recognitions of labeling and all these things, because otherwise it will pose additional cost to the production sector. So indeed, if Chile is progressing in this line, hopefully he can make contacts with the rest of the countries, and we can manage to do something at the regional level to avoid additional costs. In relation to the question by Peter, I'm afraid that this is net and gross at the same time, because when you consider national accounting, what you have there is, let's say, the formal employment. So yes, it could be net in terms that this sector increase the employment of I would say the formal employment in the region is a complete regional exercise. But the truth is, in this sector and in general terms in the region, the informal labor may reach in some countries even the 70%. So what probably will happen there is that you get informal workers to the formal workers. but still you will have so probably it will help us to formalize some employments instead of creating new net employments. So it's a kind of produce high or better quality employment in the region. The exercise that should be done is to consider if the formal recycling sector is less labor intensive than the informal. What I'm afraid it is, because it has more capital investment. So we need to be very careful of the social implications, despite that there is a lot of informality. Still, these people need, this income to live. So this kind of transitions, this is something that should be discussed, particularly in the middle and less developed countries.
Thank you very much, Carlos. Okay, we are running a bit late, so I'll have to cut it here now, and we move into the closing remarks. The idea is that four relevant speakers give very precise and short remarks according to what they've heard and their experience. And so we're talking here of hopefully 5 minutes. And yes, Eduardo, I know that's hard. Carlos, can you tell me if Jose Luis will be present? Or I understand he was in meetings with ministers and
unfortunately, we are having here in ECLAC the Forum of Ministers of Housing, which is one of the sectors that have to apply the circular economy. So Jose Luis is at this moment in the room, and there has been some delay, as always in ECLAC.
No problem.
We have 7 minutes.
So you're right, Eduardo. That does not mean you have more time. So Eduardo, now Peter Borki, and Thomas Sayet, and maybe Carlos, we can give you if you want. Would you like to step in for Jose Luis, or is that okay?
No, it's okay.
No, okay. So we have basically 3 presenters: Eduardo, Peter, and Thomas, and we have actually any comment that any of us additionally wants to make. Rob?
We have a little bit more minutes.
Well, we are a bit behind anyway. Rob, you have something to say? Yes?
No, I just wanted to be included in the list. I have some final remarks.
In the list of closing remarks?
Yeah, if you mind.
Sure.
If you don't mind.
Okay, fine. Okay, fine.
Rob can speak in place of me. So
okay, that sounds good. Eduardo, I'm very interested in hearing your remarks, your reactions.
I'll be very quick. As it happened in the case of CO2 emissions and regulation, we should assume that the OECD country will go ahead of the rest of the world. And that's a fact. We have to deal with that. Then the carbon cross-border tax that Raul was mentioning is one of the main drivers of private action in terms of CO2 mitigation. Then the question I have is, well, we will fall behind in implementing economic, I would say developing countries in economic and other regulations. Then we believe that if strong regulation like the carbon cross-border tax is implemented in this area, will have an incentive in terms of export. Let's assume, for example, Latin America is a very important exporter of food and fruit and other things. What kind of packaging you will allow entering the European Union? That will create a very interesting impact in our exporters. Regarding structural change and the trade-off between growth and reducing, the impact, I believe probably the models are assuming a kind of a static technology. You are taking away the production function that you have today. And in fact, even in these sectors, construction, mining, many of these countries are working, even Chile, for example, is working in trying to change the production function and to get, and then you have to do a prospective analysis of what would happen in different scenarios. Let's go to Chile. Yeah, Chile has been kind of a leader in the developing world or emerging countries in all these environmental issues. The NDCs, we were the first, probably the extended production responsibility also, we were the first. But connecting with the issue of changing technology on these big polluter sectors, I just want to bring something that the OECD Development Center assessed in Chile at some point, which is the Transforma program. You did a PTPR analysis of these programs, and we started with this, copying the Horizon 2020 initiative of a smart specialization of Europe, and we put that in place in Chile, and we set goals, you know, in order to have a metrics to see whether this program will have impact. And first was social capital, second productivity, and third sustainability. And then the roadmap we brought from Cambridge, the technology roadmap methodology, we trained many people on that. And let me tell you that in mining, green mining was included as one of the goals, and this is not just CO2. In construction, sustainability was the key driver for innovation in construction. Even we established a wood construction sector because we knew that this will have environmentally and sustainability impact, very important. Just to give you examples, in construction, one of the main objective was to bring industrialized construction, and even we subsidize foreign direct investment with this type of innovation. And we know that the waste of this type of technology is much lower. And the other thing is building information modeling also is helping. Then we have the BIM plan, and now it's being taken all over Latin America. In mining, we will talk about mining specifically, but let's say that on these Transforma programs, we made significant progress in terms of implementation. We were able to have almost $450 million in R&D with 43% participation of the private sector, and a significant part of this R&D was linked to sustainability, and there was a connection between productivity improvement and sustainability. Regarding the other thing that we did in the previous Bachelet government was to negotiate lithium royalties, but we separated $500 million just for innovation for green development. And then we were able, the first center that was put in place was the Recircularity Center in Iquique, in the region in the north, close to the mining sector. The second one was the Electromobility Center, and we're still pending from the Green Mining Center that should be put in place. Regarding mining, I do have a few comments, very short, on what Raul did. Raul basically modeled a scope 2 pollution, and the program is called Alta Ley. You know, now there is a corporation that bring together all the stakeholders into that, take care of CO2 emissions at scope 1, 2, and 3. We have even a green hydrogen roadmap that has been developed by Alta Ley in order to address and tackle diesel use in scope 1, which will be very, very important, and also in scope 3, electromobility also. We have water problems. Water is a key factor on the green mining. We just launched last week the green mining initiative that was supported by the Senate of Chile, and we brought all the stakeholders. Then we have CO2, water, biodiversity, and probably the most important one is tailing. And from the Transforma programs, there were a few consortia, technology consortia, just focused on tailing, and which is the very important issue, because 60% of the future of mining is going to happen in the center region of Chile, and that will have a big social license issue. The social license is another driver of transformation in this area. But now we have taken the Transforma programs into recirculation, the circular economy. And today we have a Transforma program for this goal, for the circular economy. And the way it works, they are working on technology road mapping, co-financing of R&D, of innovation, promotion, and we have great expectation that on the roadmap that has been done in this area, at least factor one, which is innovation, we are going to have progress. The last comment is that, yes, we are missing more economic instrument to create the right incentive in Chile. In a way, we have many command and control type of instrument, which are, we know, not very efficient, because if you have a percentage, 60% across the board, well, in some cases, the marginal cost of reaching that will be very high. In other cases, very low. And you want to have, the possibility of trading rights or whatever, and we are not taking advantage of that. Okay.
You all very, okay, very illuminating comments. And so if there are any comments to your comments, I think it's very interesting. What refers to me, yes, it's scope 2. And we mentioned that from the beginning, and there's, sorry, the bottles can do what they can do. But yes, it's just an initial analysis, right? That okay, tells us what happens when we are thinking just of scope 2. Eduardo, thank you. Okay, so I understand Rob would come fill in for Peter, or Peter, if you want to comment anyway, you are welcome. Rob, you're muted.
All right. Thank you. 3 remarks from my side, and I'll try to be brief. First, Eduardo pointed out, I think very rightfully, that companies are constantly striving for efficiency improvements, for doing things better, and you cannot take a static analysis to understand what the future looks like. I fully agree with that, and I want to add one element that I often see overlooked in this type of discussions, and that is, if you assume cost savings in the future, if you assume that it will be cheaper to produce, normally that means you assume there will be less jobs involved. Most of the cost savings come from labor savings. So doing an analysis where you assume that a technology will be 20% cheaper, but it will have the same employment effects, is over-optimistic, and you will not get that employment effect if you assume that the costs are going to be reduced that much. So keep that in mind. You need a detailed model to sort that out. Second comment. There's a need for global cooperation and front runners. So you need international coordination of policies. You need ODA and other financial assistance for developing countries for improving their waste management, for example. But you also need front runners and regional front runners. And I think Peter already applauded Chile for that, but I want to second that. What Chile is doing in terms of setting up circular economy roadmaps and circular economy policies does help the entire region to make a transition to a circular economy. not only because of learning by doing, but also, for example, by setting up markets where you can actually have markets for secondary materials, for example. And that those types of things are all very important. And you need that, because in the end, what the modeling shows is a national circular economy transition is fine, a regional circular economy transition is good, but the real benefits come from a global transition to a circular economy. You do need to have a global improvements in order to reach the real environmental gains. And plastics is ultimately the example of that, where you see 80% of plastics leakage to the aquatic environment is in Asia. And if we don't act, it will be 50% or more in Africa by the middle of the century. So you do need a global transition, and we do need to make sure that less developed countries are also participating in this transition and have their role to play. And let me end, my first remark is actually very short. Carlos summarized for me this workshop in 2 words that I really think fit very nicely with our discussion today. And that is, we need to align incentives. That's it for me.
Okay. Thank you very much, Rob. Peter, do you want to jump in, or do we go to Thomas?
I just make one quick addition to what Rob has so ably summarized, and that is maybe that more attention needs to be placed on the social dimension. And I think both Carlos and Eduardo, I think Eduardo, you were talking about the social license to operate, and I think that's a very important dimension. That we tend not to focus on yet. In the other dimension, I think that Carlos brought up is the current large role of the informal sector in some places, and a potential cost in employment, even if it's hidden currently. That might be implied by actually formalizing, this sector, and so I guess my conclusion from this is there need to be flanking policies to deal with that social dimension, and to avoid, that there are losers, from the transition that might ultimately wield their weight to block the transition. So a plea for flanking policies and more thinking around that, including here at the OECD.
Thank you, Peter. Thomas?
Thank you very much. I'll just make some brief general comments. First of all, I'm very happy about this webinar, and very happy that academic research is addressing these issues. I remember a few years ago, and it was not easy to find research on circular economy. I remember a few years ago, actually, you went to Google and you saw Google Trends where you can find research that's been done on different issues, and circular economy had a big spike. And nowadays, we have a lot of circular economy research globally, and I'm very happy to realize that we are also having local circular economy research in Chile. I think this really eases the job of policymakers to have constructive criticism and local data and data on local implications on what you're doing. So let me just applaud that. A second thing I would want to say is that I find myself a bit worried when I see all these graphs and projections that tell you, well, by 2060, we're going to triple or quadruple our consumption of materials. And then you ask yourself the question, well, that's what we want to avoid. So here I second Eduardo when he mentioned we need to sort of have baseline scenarios and sort of to project the current status of things, and if current things go as as they're going, what's going to happen. But I think we also need to develop pathways to different things, right? So we need to say, okay, so if we wanted to keep materials use, in line, we want that to stop growing. What would need to happen? Which technological changes would need, and to project that in the future, because I think that's as important as the other kind of research. This second issue is what sort of might drive the imagination of policymakers to sort of make those pathways happen. So I think that's very important. I'll finalize by saying that one thing is clear. Circular economy has become a key toolbox to achieve sustainable development. And I think it is a good thing that nowadays we're not just talking about the climate crisis, but we're talking about the triple crisis. And circular economy is very interesting in this regard, because you can make the argument that it contributes to the solution of the three crises, right? If you use less materials, we emit less greenhouse gas emissions. If we control plastics, we not just pollute less, but enable a healthier ecosystem in the seas, for instance. And of course, circular economy addresses directly the pollution issue. So I think it's good to broaden the scope, and it's good to realize that circular economy can help us tackle all of those crises. And finally, I just want to thank the OECD and the Universidad Adolfo Ibáñez for organizing this interesting seminar. Thank you very much.
Thank you all very much. I am really very happy that we're incredible. It's 12:30 sharp. So, but I do want to take advantage of the fact that I am closing, and I want to say very, very briefly, this is the economics of the circular economy transition. That's the name of this seminar, right? And so, in terms of the economics, one of the things Rob has just highlighted is the importance of aligning objectives and giving the correct incentives. That's one key issue that is key to obtaining these pathways that Tomás is basically fighting for, right, or defending. That's one point. Two, the need to consider the social dimension. This is very key in Latin America. So in Latin America, nothing is going to happen if we don't really move very strongly in improving the distributive inequalities we have, and a host of social concerns. And so any policy that we promote has to include, be inclusive and include the social dimension. Three, I did not see much relating to the role of, there's a large role for the state, but there's one important role with the green public procurement that is mentioned, but then again, not mentioned very strongly. I would suggest that in terms of state response and state action, at least in Latin America, green public procurement is a very important instrument. Fourth, Latin America, implementation gaps and leakage. Okay, we have nice graphs and nice lines and policies, but we have to implement. And the implementation, the weakness in the implementation of policies in our countries and the weakness in continuity in policies is a big concern. So that's an issue that we also have to address. And finally, relating to the pathway, Tomás is suggesting my question to Peter, I think we have to, there's, of course, the question is, where are we going with the circular economy? So we need to ask ourselves, what are the goals? And then we have to go into the benefits. So of course, producing plastics is not something you want to do just and pollute plastic, but then there are benefits associated to this. So the question is, what are the benefits? And of course, what are the substitution options and the technologies in terms of degradability or increasing degradability of this type of products? So I tend to think that we also need to think hard and strong when we're thinking of the economics in terms of the benefits and substitution possibilities that exist. So with that, I think I want to close. Thank you very much. This has been very interesting, and I hope for the participants it has been as interesting as it is to me.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks for
Thanks,
all.
everyone.
Bye. Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Have a nice week.
Same to you. Bye.
Bye.
Okay.